Welcome to the channel. Here, we use AI to dive deep into powerful books and break down their core ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore Sedated by James Davies, unpacking its insights and what they mean for how we understand mental health. If you enjoy deep, clear explorations like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
If a child gets leukemia today, their chance of survival is like a staggering 300% higher than it was just 40 years ago.
It's an incredible advancement.
Right. We have the x-rays, the blood tests, the targeted treatments. Modern medicine, in so many areas, it just works. But when you look at mental health, the system is fundamentally broken.
Oh, completely broken.
Despite billions of dollars in funding and, endless awareness campaigns, plus absolute record numbers of prescriptions, clinical outcomes for mental health just haven't improved. In fact, by several measures, they are getting worse.
It is a profound paradox. I mean, we are talking about mental health more at any point in human history, right?
Yeah.
We're prescribing more medication, spending vastly more money, yet collectively, society is feeling significantly worse.
And that incredibly frustrating reality is the focus of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a grounding and really challenging source text called Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis by James Davies.
He's a medical anthropologist and an expert drug advisor.
Exactly. Now you, the listener, are going to hear a lot about economics today, specifically this term called neoliberalism. Basically, that's an economic philosophy that believes the free market should solve everything, including healthcare, and that individuals, not systems, are responsible for their own success or failure.
Which is a crucial context.
Right. But I want to make it clear, our goal here isn't to take a left or right political stance. We are just looking at the blueprints of this system we all live in to understand how modern economic structures might have fundamentally altered the way we treat human suffering.
And that's an essential lens to look through. If we want to understand why those mental health outcomes are flatlining, we can't just look at the individual. We have to, look at the mechanics of the systems that define what an illness even is.
Right. Which takes us straight to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. It's basically the absolute rule book for psychiatry.
It really is the ultimate gatekeeper. Back in the early 1970s, the DSM listed roughly 106 mental disorders. Today, it's somewhere around 370.
Wow. That's a massive jump.
It is. Now, if you discover over 200 new diseases in just a few decades, you would assume there had been some massive, undeniable biological breakthrough in how we scan the brain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'd assume we got better microscopes or something.
Exactly. But the source highlights a very uncomfortable reality. Unlike general medicine, there are zero biological tests for the vast majority of these disorders. There is no blood test for depression. There is no MRI that definitively diagnoses anxiety.
Okay, let's unpack this. If they aren't finding these disorders under a microscope, how do they end up in the manual?
Through committee consensus.
Wait, really? Just a committee?
Yep. Small groups of psychiatrists would gather, debate human behaviors and emotions, and quite literally vote by raising their hands on whether to include a new disorder and exactly what symptoms should define it.
That's wild.
They steadily lowered the threshold for what constitutes an illness. So things like grief, work stress, or a general lack of concentration, things that were historically viewed as normal human distress, they were rebranded as symptoms of psychiatric illnesses.
So creating these diagnoses is less like discovering a new planet with a telescope and more like a committee raising their hands to vote on whether Pluto should still be considered a planet.
That's a great way to put it, though. It's a bit more insidious than the Pluto debate, because redefining a planet doesn't create a billion-dollar industry.
Right, good point.
But the underlying mechanism of voting on reality is exactly the same. They drew a line in the sand based on cultural norms, not biological markers.
But I want to reason through this because that completely flips my understanding of why we give diagnoses in the first place. I would assume getting a medical label generates sympathy.
You'd think so, yeah.
If you can say, hey, I have a biochemical brain disease, it's not my fault, wouldn't that reduce the stigma and give the person some comfort?
It sounds totally logical. But the data shows the exact opposite. The author cites a really revealing electric shock study from Auburn University.
Oh, the shock study.
Yes, researchers had volunteers administer electric shocks to individuals who failed a test. When the volunteers were told the person's erratic behavior was due to a difficult past or a stressful life event, they were actually quite lenient.
Okay, that makes sense.
But when they were told the behavior was caused by a, quote, biochemical brain disease, they actually administered harsher, faster electric shocks.
Wait, why would a medical label make people more punitive?
Because framing an emotional problem as a permanent biological defect subconsciously kindles fear. If someone is reacting to a bad situation, we can relate to that. We empathize.
Because we've all been stressed out before.
Exactly. But if their brain is broken or chemically defective, society views them as unpredictable or fundamentally damaged. Medicalizing normal distress actually increases societal hostility. And worse, for the patients themselves, it increases self-stigma.
So they just feel broken.
Yes. They stop seeing themselves as healthy people reacting to a difficult world and start viewing themselves as permanently flawed.
And yet we've totally embraced this manual. I mean, the DSM-5 was a #1 bestseller on Amazon when it came out. It actually beat out Harry Potter.
At $88 a copy, no less. But that wasn't just because of massive public curiosity. It's an open industry secret that the pharmaceutical industry bought copies in bulk to distribute for free to clinicians.
Oh, wow, of course.
You see, a diagnosis is only half the business model. You can't profit off the DSM unless you have a pill to pair it with. Expanding the definition of illness created a massive, highly profitable, totally captive market for their drugs.
Well, we have to be careful here, right? We aren't saying severe mental illness doesn't exist or that nobody benefits from psychiatric medication. I mean, antidepressants genuinely save lives.
Absolutely. The book is not arguing that depression is fake or that medications never work. What the author is arguing is that we have taken a tool meant for severe, acute distress and blanketed the entire population with it to mask a societal failure.
Got it.
The author draws a really compelling parallel between the explosion of personal credit card debt and the explosion of psychiatric drugs, both of which started skyrocketing in the 1980s.
Because wages flatlined back then, but the cost of living kept going up, so credit cards became an economic band-aid. They let people keep consuming and surviving in a system that wasn't actually paying them enough to live.
Precisely. And psychiatric drugs began functioning the exact same way, but biologically. They became a biological band-aid to mask the psychological distress caused by that very same hyper-competitive, precarious economy.
So it's about keeping the machine running.
Yeah, it became a sedation strategy. The goal shifted from curing people to just keeping them functioning enough to go to work in a system that was burning them out.
But wait, if these prescriptions have tripled over the last few decades and they are supposedly helping us function, shouldn't overall disability rates related to mental health be going down?
That is the ultimate test of any medical intervention, right?
Yeah.
If a treatment works, the burden of the disease should drop.
Right.
But Robert Whitaker's research tears that assumption down. He looked at countries with completely different welfare systems, the US, the UK, Sweden, Iceland, and in every single country where antidepressant use doubled, mental health disability also doubled.
Could that just be because we're finally getting better at recognizing the sickness and reporting it? Correlation isn't causation.
That's the standard defense, for sure.
Yeah.
But the long-term clinical data suggests something much more concerning is happening. Take Professor Martin Harrow's 15-year study on patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. The conventional wisdom in psychiatry is that these patients must stay on antipsychotics for life or they will completely deteriorate. But Harrow tracked two groups over 15 years and found that the unmedicated group actually had vastly superior recovery rates.
Wait, really? By how much?
44% of the unmedicated group entered full recovery, compared to just 6% of those who stayed on the medication.
44% versus 6%. That is a massive discrepancy. Why would the medication prevent long-term recovery?
Well, there's evidence pointing to physical changes in the brain over time. Neuroscientist Nancy Andreessen conducted MRI studies showing that long-term antipsychotic use literally shrinks brain tissue.
It shrinks the brain.
Yes, it slowly atrophies the prefrontal cortex. The degeneration they were seeing wasn't just a symptom of schizophrenia, it was a physical result of the long-term medication.
That is terrifying.
The drugs might suppress acute hallucinations in the short term, but long-term, they can suppress the brain's natural healing pathways and cognitive function.
Which explains why places like Norway have started these revolutionary medication-free treatment wards.
Yes, and that was entirely driven by patient demand. People were fighting for the right to heal through social support, therapy, and safe environments without forced sedation.
So, if the author's premise is that we are increasingly being sedated to cope with our environment, we really have to talk about what we are being sedated against. And that brings us to where you, the listener, probably spend most of your waking hours: the workplace.
This is where the economic shift really hits home. When Western economies transitioned away from manufacturing and heavily into the service sector, the very definition of a good employee changed.
How so?
Well, in a factory, your boss just counts the widgets you produce. Your mood doesn't really matter. But in a service economy, employers demand the good worker persona. They want extroverted, optimistic, relentlessly positive team players. Making a profit became inextricably tied to the emotional conduct of the staff.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It sounds like modern work requires us to act in a play that never ends, and if we break character, we lose our livelihood.
That's a perfect analogy.
That makes me think of the corporate personality tests the book mentions. There's a story as a young writer named Natalie who was trying to get temp jobs to pay her rent.
Ah, yes.
She kept taking these pre-employment personality tests and answering them. Honestly, at meetings, she was an introvert, she was creative, maybe a bit unpredictable in her routine, and she just kept getting rejected. She literally had to research how to fake the tests, essentially building an artificial persona just to secure a basic paycheck.
Because, like you said, you're acting in an endless play. And if you break character, you lose your livelihood. That constant emotional acting is exhausting, and it leads to a profound sense of alienation.
I can imagine.
In 2015, there were these rogue posters put up on the London Tube highlighting the silent epidemic of meaningless jobs. One of them read, "How can one even begin to speak of dignity in work when one secretly feels one's job should not exist?" Studies continually show that over half of workers feel emotionally disengaged or find their daily work utterly meaningless.
So you have a workforce that is exhausted, faking their personalities, and feeling alienated. How do companies respond? I'm guessing they don't just lower the workload or increase the pay.
No, of course not. They individualize the problem. They hire well-being consultants. They bring in programs like mental health first aid or MHFA.
What does that do?
This is a program that literally trains coworkers to spot the symptoms of mental illness in their colleagues. If someone is uncommunicative, lacking energy, or showing poor performance, they're flagged and referred to doctors for therapy or pills.
Which completely depoliticizes the toxic environment. Instead of management saying, hey, our office culture is toxic and the workload is physically impossible, the system points at the employee and says, you have a biochemical defect, please go to the doctor and get fixed so you can come back to work.
Exactly. And the consequences of that deflection can be tragic. The author recounts the heartbreaking story of Malcolm Henderson, a lecturer at Cardiff University.
Oh, that story was rough.
He took his own life due to a crushing, unmanageable workload that he had repeatedly begged his administration for help with. The really bitter irony is that he died right in the middle of his university's well-being fortnight.
A well-being fortnight? What were they even offering?
Things like free bike rides, mindfulness seminars, and tips on resilience. They offer absolutely zero structural changes to the workload that was destroying him. It is the ultimate sticking plaster over a structural wound.
So if the workplace is the thing making you sick, what happens when you finally break down and seek help or you lose that job entirely? Because according to the source, the therapy system that catches you is designed purely to get you back onto the very hamster wheel that broke you.
We see this clearly in the UK's IAPT program, Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. It's a massive government therapy initiative. But look at who actually designed it.
Who was it?
It wasn't spearheaded by a coalition of mental health advocates. It was masterminded by an economist, Lord Layard, alongside a psychologist. When they pitched this to the government in 2005, their core argument wasn't about human happiness. It was a clear economic promise.
Oh, let me guess, saving money.
You got it. They argued a national therapy service would save the government billions of pounds by getting people off unemployment benefits and keeping them productive.
But wait, I want to look at this from the other side, though. Isn't helping someone get back on their feet and helping them find employment a genuinely positive goal for a therapy session? I mean, we all need a purpose and we all need an income.
It sounds incredibly positive until you examine how it works in practice. The therapy is completely blind to the quality of the work. It ignores the fundamental difference between good work that provides dignity, autonomy, and a living wage, and bad work that destroys mental health.
So they just push you into anything.
Yes, so the system forces people back into the exact same precarious, zero-hour, low-paying jobs that made them sick in the first place. And because the therapists themselves are under immense bureaucratic pressure to hit these back-to-work targets, the staff suffer from massive burnout.
But doesn't the program claim to have really high success rates? I remember seeing some impressive numbers.
They do. IAPT publicly boasts a 46% recovery rate. But the mechanics of how they get that number are heavily manipulated.
How's so?
They achieve 46% by completely excluding the 50% of patients who drop out of the therapy because it isn't working for them. I wish I was. When independent researchers went in and analyzed the data correctly, including the people who dropped out, the real recovery rate plummeted to somewhere between 16 and 23%.
Wait, 16 to 23%. Isn't that roughly the exact same rate as people who spontaneously recover from depression with zero treatment at all?
It is essentially identical.
Wow.
The massive government intervention provides almost no statistical benefit over doing nothing because it isn't addressing the root cause of the distress. And this obsession with forcing people to work reaches its absolute darkest peak in unemployment centers through a practice the author calls psychocompulsion.
This part of the source was wild.
Yeah.
The story of Izzy Coxell. She was unemployed, and under the threat of having her basic survival benefits cut off, she was forced to attend a mandatory course run by a private contractor called A4E.
Right, and this wasn't a practical course on how to format a resume or learn a new software skill.
Yeah.
It's a bizarre, coercive, motivational boot camp. The instructor stood up and told the unemployed attendees that they needed to talk, breathe, eat, and shit belief in themselves.
They were literally blaming unemployment on a bad mindset. There was a 60-year-old man in that class, James, who couldn't get hired because of blatant age discrimination in his industry.
Exactly.
And the instructor explicitly told him that his age wasn't the barrier to getting a job. His mindset was the barrier. It's this incredibly toxic, phony empowerment. It tells you that you have infinite psychological power over your reality, which just sets you up for crushing self-blame when systemic barriers like ageism or a collapsed local economy stop you from succeeding.
It's gaslighting on an institutional level. And the pressure on the staff running these private programs is equally corrosive. Remember A4E, the company running that boot camp?
Yeah.
The author details the story of Zabar Khalil, who was a gentle, well-loved administrator there. The recruiters at A4E were put under such brutal, commission-driven targets by the government to get people off benefits that they literally started faking employment records.
How did they even do that? Get away with it, I mean.
Well, the recruiters would go to local coffee shops, find people who had recently been hired on their own, and bribe them with cash to sign forms saying A4E had placed them in the job.
Unbelievable.
Zabar, the administrator who didn't even earn commission, unknowingly signed off on the fake paperwork as part of his daily admin duties. The office was eventually raided by police. 6 of his colleagues went to prison for fraud, and Zabar's life was turned upside down with a criminal record.
All because of arbitrary targets.
Yes. It shows the logical conclusion of a system that prioritizes arbitrary economic targets over actual human well-being.
It just corrupts everything it touches. And this target-driven, high-pressure culture doesn't just magically appear when we turn 18. The author argues we are baking this into our society starting in childhood.
Very much so. Look at the education system, specifically in the UK. We're seeing a massive special needs epidemic in schools. Between the early 2000s and 2011, the number of pupils diagnosed with special educational needs doubled, capturing nearly 20% of the entire school-age population.
And the vast majority of these weren't physical disabilities, right? They were mental, emotional, or behavioral problems.
Correct.
And when this spike happened, how did the school regulators like Ofsted, the UK's inspection agency, respond?
They blamed the teachers. Ofsted claimed teachers were gaming the system, slapping special needs labels on underachieving kids to either get more funding or to excuse poor test scores in the National League tables.
So what does this all mean? It sounds to me like handing a kid an umbrella in a Category 5 hurricane, and then when they inevitably get soaking wet, diagnosing them with a biological water retention disorder?
That is a very apt way to look at it. The anthropologist Marilyn Strathern has a concept for this called benign corruption.
Benign corruption.
Yeah. When you starve a public sector like education of resources, pack the classrooms, and enforce impossible punitive testing targets, playing the system becomes the only intelligent choice. Teachers aren't maliciously diagnosing kids to cheat the system. They're desperate to get those kids extra help and extra time on exams.
That makes total sense.
But instead of fixing the defunded schools, we pathologize the children. We tell them they lack resilience. We teach them that their anxiety about impossible exams is a personal psychological deficit to be managed with therapy or drugs, rather than a totally natural response to an unnatural environment.
But to get those drugs to all those kids and to the burned out workers and the unemployed, I mean, you need a massive pipeline. And the source argues that the root cause of this massive pharmaceutical reach traces back to a major shift in how we regulate medicine.
The historical context here is vital. If we go back to the 1960s, a U.S. senator named Kefauver pushed for strict drug safety laws. And he was entirely vindicated by the thalidomide tragedy.
That was the drug for morning sickness, right?
Yes, an undertested drug given for morning sickness that caused thousands of babies to be born with severe limb deformities. Following that, Kefauver's laws demanded that pharmaceutical companies prove their drugs were not just safe, but genuinely effective before they could be sold.
But then we hit the 1980s, the era of Milton Friedman and neoliberalism.
Right. The political tide shifted. Economists argued that these strict regulations were stifling the free market and keeping drugs away from consumers. But they couldn't just abolish the regulatory agencies outright.
So what did they do?
The compromise was to fundamentally change how those agencies were funded.
By handing them over to the industry they were supposed to be policing.
Essentially, yes. Today, regulatory agencies like the MHRA, which is the UK's equivalent of the FDA, are funded directly by the user fees of the very pharmaceutical companies they regulate.
Talk about a conflict of interest.
It's massive. Furthermore, there is a revolving door of executives moving between the regulatory boards and big pharma. And the mechanics of this deregulation are astounding. It allows pharmaceutical companies to design their own clinical trials, bury the negative data showing their drugs perform no better than placebos, and flood the market with less effective, highly profitable medications.
Has no one in government tried to stop this? I mean, this seems like a huge scandal.
They have tried. In 2005, a member of parliament named David Hinchliffe led a scathing parliamentary inquiry exposing all of this. The report detailed the ghostwriting of medical journals, the buried clinical trials, the deep conflicts of interest.
I guess it was buried.
Completely ignored by the political establishment. Because heavily reforming the agency would have violated that dominant neoliberal faith in deregulation. The free market couldn't be restricted, even if the evidence showed public health was being compromised.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from the voting committees of the DSM to the high-pressure workplaces to the deregulation of the pharmaceutical industry. Let's pull this all together.
Sure.
The author's central thesis across all these examples is that our emotional distress, our anxiety, our burnout, our depression is often a completely sane, natural reaction to incredibly complex social and economic pressures.
Exactly.
But to protect the economic status quo, society has repackaged this valid systemic distress as an individual medical failing. So, to you, listening right now, the next time you feel totally overwhelmed by your job, your debt, or your life circumstances, consider whether your brain is truly malfunctioning, or if you are just having a normal human reaction to an overly demanding world.
I want to leave you with one final haunting example from the source material that I think perfectly encapsulates everything we've discussed.
Okay.
Over the past few decades in India, agricultural multinational companies forced local farmers to buy patented genetically modified seeds and expensive fertilizers. This corporate policy drove hundreds of thousands of small farmers into crushing, inescapable debt.
Oh no.
And tragically, it led to a massive wave of farmer suicides. The response from the World Health Organization and the state wasn't to challenge the multinational companies. They didn't reform the devastating corporate agricultural policies or forgive the debt.
What did they do?
Instead, they sent in teams of psychiatrists to diagnose the farmers and hand out antidepressants.
Wow. It leaves you with a profound question. When a society's canaries are dying in the coal mine, should we fix the mine or do we just sedate the canaries? It turns out that when the diagnostic X-ray of our mental health is murky, maybe it's not the patient that's broken. Maybe it's the world they're living in. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.